There is a strange question hiding inside one of the most cheerful premises in modern animated comedy. What if the happiest pet in New York is secretly terrified? At first, The Secret Life of Pets seems designed to answer a simple fantasy. What do our animals do when we leave the apartment, close the door, and disappear into the human world? Do they throw parties? Watch television? Raid the refrigerator? Hold secret meetings? The movie turns that childhood curiosity into a colorful New York adventure filled with barking dogs, sarcastic cats, criminal rabbits, sewer hideouts, impossible chases, and enough physical comedy to keep the entire story moving at a frantic pace. But underneath all that noise is something much more recognizable and much less comfortable. Max is happy, but he is not secure. He loves Katie, and more importantly, he believes he understands exactly where he stands in her life. She is his person. Their apartment is his kingdom. Their routine is proof that everything is exactly where it belongs. Every morning begins with Katie leaving. Every day contains the rituals that make Max feel connected to her. And every evening confirms the reassuring fact that she comes home. Then Duke arrives. And suddenly, the story stops being about what pets do when humans leave, and becomes a story about what happens when someone you love chooses to bring another person into your world. To Max, Duke is not simply a large, messy dog who needs somewhere to live. Duke is evidence that Max's perfect position can be challenged. He is bigger, louder, less controlled, and connected to a part of Katie's life that Max did not expect. Max's jealousy is therefore more complicated than simple dislike. He is frightened. He does not know whether Katie can love two dogs in the same way, and because he interprets his relationship with Katie through the limited perspective of a pet, every change feels larger than it might to a human observer. That is one of the film's most interesting ideas. Max cannot ask Katie what she is thinking. He cannot understand why she brought Duke home. He cannot receive a reassuring explanation about how affection works. He can only observe. And when people observe without understanding, fear has a habit of filling in the missing information. Max sees Duke occupying the apartment and assumes he is occupying his place in Katie's heart. The comedy comes from how extreme that interpretation becomes, but the emotion underneath it is surprisingly ordinary. Almost anyone who has ever feared being replaced can recognize the feeling. A new friend, a new sibling, a new relationship, a new colleague, or simply a change in someone's attention can trigger the same irrational question. If they love someone else, does that mean there is less love left for me? The movie eventually places that question beside an even darker version of it through Snowball, the abandoned rabbit who has transformed rejection into rage. Max responds to insecurity by becoming possessive. Duke carries the wound of abandonment. Snowball turns abandonment into revenge. 3 animals, 3 responses, 1 underlying fear. I am no longer wanted. That connection is what makes The Secret Life of Pets more interesting than its marketing initially suggests. The film is not asking us to believe that animals secretly live exactly like humans. Instead, it uses animals as emotional mirrors. Their exaggerated behavior gives human anxieties a physical form. Jealousy becomes a dog refusing to share his home. Abandonment becomes a rabbit leading an underground rebellion. Loneliness becomes a lost pet wandering through a city that suddenly feels enormous. Even New York itself becomes part of the psychology. Above ground, there are apartments, parks, sidewalks, traffic, restaurants, bridges, and millions of people moving through lives they barely notice. Beneath them is another city, one inhabited by animals who have their own relationships, rivalries, fears, and communities. The brighter the human world looks, the more interesting the hidden world beneath it becomes. And that contrast gives the film its central tension, the difference between what a relationship looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the inside. Before we follow Max into that hidden world, however, it is worth asking why this particular concept works so well in the first place. The Secret Life of Pets arrived at a moment when Illumination had already discovered the commercial power of taking an instantly recognizable idea and turning it into a high-energy animated comedy. The studio had built its identity through Despicable Me, a franchise that understood the value of simple emotional premises, highly readable characters, physical comedy, and visual designs that could be understood almost instantly. The Secret Life of Pets offered another premise with almost no explanation required. Everyone knows what a pet is. Everyone knows what it feels like to leave one alone. And almost everyone has, at some point, wondered what happens after the door closes. That question was already funny before the movie added a single joke. It gave the filmmakers a foundation that was both universal and flexible. A dog could behave like a dog while also behaving like a spoiled roommate. A cat could remain recognizably feline, while becoming a comic portrait of indifference. A rabbit could be adorable enough to sell toys and simultaneously intense enough to lead an underground revolution. The concept could move from domestic comedy to action movie without abandoning its basic premise. Chris Renaud, working with co-director Yarrow Cheney, brought the project into Illumination's established visual and comedic language, while writers Cinco Paul, Ken Dorio, and Brian Lynch shaped the story around a conflict that was easy to understand even before the characters began speaking. Behind them, producers including Chris Meledandri and Janet Healy helped position the film as a major original property at a time when animation audiences were surrounded by established brands. That distinction mattered. An original animated film has to introduce its world, its characters, its rules, and its emotional stakes at the same time. A sequel can rely on familiarity. The Secret Life of Pets could not. It needed a hook strong enough to explain itself in a trailer and characters memorable enough to survive outside the movie. The solution was to make the animals themselves the selling point. The marketing could show Max staring suspiciously at Duke, Snowball screaming with comic intensity, dogs dancing, cats eating, birds flying through apartments, and a city full of pets apparently behaving completely differently once humans were gone. The premise was instantly communicable. You did not need to know the plot. You only needed to see a dog acting like a human when his owner walked out the door. In a crowded 2016 animation marketplace populated by recognizable brands from Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks, and Illumination itself, that simplicity was an advantage. The film could say, in effect, you already know this world. You have only never seen it from this angle. That became the central marketing promise. And the promise was particularly effective because it connected to both children and adults. Children could imagine their pets secretly having adventures. Adults could recognize the apartment routines, the pet-owner relationships, the strange habits that animals develop, and the absurd amount of personality people project onto them. The film could therefore sell nostalgia and curiosity at the same time. It reminded audiences of the universal fantasy that the moment humans leave, the rules disappear. But what makes the final movie more interesting is that the secret life it reveals is not simply a life of freedom. It is also a life of dependency. Max is free to imagine himself as the master of his apartment, yet his emotional existence revolves around Katie. Duke appears to have freedom in his physical size and strength, yet his entire history is shaped by losing a human owner. Snowball declares war on human control while desperately seeking belonging. Freedom and attachment keep colliding. That contradiction will become more important as the story develops, because the pets may dream about escaping human rules, but what most of them actually want is not independence. They want to know that someone will come back for them. And that brings us into the world of Max himself. New York appears first as an enormous, energetic environment, but Max experiences it on a much smaller emotional scale. His world is the apartment, the neighborhood, the walks, the familiar faces, and most importantly, Katie. His daily routine gives him the confidence of someone who believes nothing important will change. He wakes, waits for Katie, watches her prepare for the day, and absorbs every little ritual as evidence of their bond. To an outside observer, Max is simply a happy dog. To Max, his routine is a contract. Katie leaves because she has to, but she always returns. Therefore, the apartment is not merely a place where he lives. It is proof that he belongs somewhere. Around him are other animals who provide a comic chorus to his domestic life. Gidget, the small white dog with an enormous amount of confidence, clearly has feelings for Max, although Max is so focused on Katie that he barely recognizes them. Chloe treats nearly everything with bored cynicism, expressing herself through food and indifference. Mel is energetic to the point of absurdity. Buddy moves through life with a relaxed confidence, and the neighborhood animals collectively create the impression that every apartment in New York contains another secret personality. Their differences are important because the film is establishing that there is no single way to be a pet. Some animals are clingy, some are independent, some are restless, some seem perfectly content doing almost nothing. The comedy depends on those recognizable personalities, but the emotional story depends on Max being unusually attached. He does not simply love Katie. He has built his identity around being Katie's dog. That is why her arrival one day with Duke feels like a disaster. Duke is physically imposing, but his real threat is symbolic. He takes up space. He changes the apartment. He changes the routine. He changes the meaning of Max's private territory. Katie tries to make the two dogs coexist, but Max does not interpret the situation as an invitation to build a new family. He interprets it as an invasion. The film exaggerates his jealousy for comedy, but the emotional logic is clear. When someone feels secure, change can feel exciting. When someone feels insecure, change looks like evidence that something is being taken away. Max's mistake is that he treats love like a limited resource. If Duke receives affection, Max assumes less affection remains for him. If Duke receives food, space, attention, or praise, Max reads each moment as another piece of his old life disappearing. The tragedy is that Katie does not seem to understand how large the emotional change feels from Max's perspective. She is simply bringing another dog into the home. Max experiences it as a referendum on his worth. The walk that follows becomes the first major step outside his controlled environment. Max and Duke are forced to navigate the city together, and their personalities immediately clash. Max is smaller, faster, and more psychologically invested in winning. Duke is stronger and more physically overwhelming, but his own insecurity is hidden beneath confidence and stubbornness. Their conflict escalates until the dogs lose their collars and become vulnerable to animal control. Suddenly, the apartment that Max considered permanent disappears from view. The dog who thought he controlled his environment is now trapped in a system he cannot understand. The animal control vehicle becomes a symbol of institutional power. When pets lose their human connection, the city does not necessarily recognize their individual histories. They become animals to be processed. Max blames Duke. Duke blames Max. Neither is prepared to accept responsibility, because both still believe the other is the source of the problem. Then Snowball appears, and the film's emotional geography expands. Until this point, Max's world has been defined by a comfortable apartment and familiar relationships. Snowball introduces the possibility that there are animals for whom home no longer exists. He is physically tiny, visually adorable, and emotionally explosive. His comedy comes partly from that contradiction. A fluffy rabbit behaves like the leader of a revolutionary army, delivering threats with a theatrical intensity that would be absurd, even from a much larger character. But Snowball's anger is not completely meaningless. He represents the animals who have been abandoned, mistreated, or discarded. His group, the Flushed Pets, has transformed resentment into an ideology. They do not merely want freedom from humans. They want revenge. That distinction is crucial. Max wants to keep the human love he already has. Snowball wants to punish the humans who failed to provide it. One is terrified of losing belonging. The other has already lost it and decided that belonging itself is a trap. The sewer becomes the perfect setting for this hidden society. Above ground, Pets live in homes and parks and exist within human systems. Below ground, abandoned animals create their own mythology. It is a world built from rejection, forgotten spaces, and the debris of the city. Max and Duke are not emotionally prepared for it. Their accidental arrival forces them across a threshold. The movie shifts from domestic comedy to adventure, but the underlying question remains unchanged. Where do you belong when the place you thought was yours suddenly becomes uncertain? Meanwhile, Gidget discovers that Max is missing, and her response reveals another form of attachment. Unlike Max, who reacts to insecurity by trying to control his environment, Gidget reacts through determination. She refuses to accept that Max is simply gone. Her feelings for him may be played for comedy, but her search becomes one of the film's most active rescue missions. She recruits Tiberius, a predatory bird whose instincts create their own problems, and gradually turns from an apparently delicate neighborhood dog into an unexpectedly capable hero. This contrast is one of the movie's most reliable comedic mechanisms. Gidget looks fragile but behaves fearlessly. Tiberius looks dangerous but is constrained by his growing affection for the group. Their partnership mirrors the larger Max-Duke relationship in a different way. Characters who initially seem incompatible discover that their differences can become strengths. While Gidget searches above ground, Max and Duke are dragged deeper into the underground world. Their relationship begins changing because survival requires cooperation. Max can no longer simply resent Duke's existence. Duke's strength becomes useful. Max's intelligence becomes useful. The rivalry that once seemed to define them begins to look increasingly childish in the face of actual danger. The movie's comedy accelerates during sequences such as the sausage factory, where the physical absurdity of the premise reaches its fullest expression. Animals race through industrial spaces, food becomes a source of chaos, and the characters move through environments that seem designed specifically to turn ordinary pet behavior into action choreography. Yet even here, the emotional story continues beneath the jokes. Max is learning that Duke is not simply the dog who replaced him. He is another animal trying to survive a world in which humans have the power to determine where he belongs. That realization becomes more powerful when Max discovers Duke's history. Duke was not simply a random dog brought into Katie's apartment. He had a previous owner, a previous home, and a previous sense of security. He remembers that life. He remembers what it meant to be wanted. And then he lost it. The revelation changes the emotional meaning of everything Max has been complaining about. Max had been terrified of losing Katie while standing inside a home where he was loved. Duke has already experienced the loss Max cannot imagine. The dog Max saw as a threat is actually carrying the same fear in a different form. That is the midpoint of the emotional story. Max begins by asking, "How do I protect my place?" He gradually starts asking, "What happened to Duke?" Those are radically different questions. The first is about possession. The second is about empathy. And once empathy enters the relationship, rivalry becomes much harder to sustain. Duke's memories also deepen the film's treatment of abandonment. To be abandoned is not merely to be physically left somewhere. It is to lose the story you thought you were living. A pet can understand a routine without understanding the reasons behind its collapse. One day there is a person, a bed, a bowl, a voice, a door that opens and closes. Then suddenly there is none of it. The animal cannot fully comprehend the human explanation. It only experiences absence. That is why Snowball and Duke are thematic opposites. Duke responds to abandonment by longing for the home he lost. Snowball responds by rejecting the humans who represent the possibility of being hurt again. Max has not experienced abandonment in the same way, but his fear allows him to imagine it. His jealousy is therefore a preventive form of grief. He tries to stop loss before it happens. That is why some of his decisions are selfish and destructive. He is trying to control uncertainty, and control often makes uncertainty worse. As the danger escalates, Max eventually reaches a point where his own safety and comfort are no longer the most important things. He begins choosing Duke's safety. That decision is the clearest evidence that his emotional journey has changed. He is no longer measuring the value of his relationship with Katie by how much space Duke occupies. He is beginning to understand that loving someone does not require removing everyone else from the equation. The film does not transform Max into a completely different dog. He remains anxious, competitive, and dramatic. But he becomes capable of loyalty that is not based on possession. That distinction is what allows the final act to work emotionally even when it becomes an avalanche of action. The climax brings the characters together in a chaotic confrontation across New York. Snowball's revenge mission reaches its peak. The abandoned pets become part of the conflict. Gidget finally reaches Max, and the relationship between Max and Duke is tested in the most physical way possible. The bridge becomes more than a convenient location for a chase. It is a transitional space, neither home nor wilderness, suspended between places. That makes it an appropriate setting for characters whose identities are changing. Max and Duke are no longer simply two dogs trying to occupy the same apartment. They have become partners. The vehicles, water, traffic, and frantic movement turn the climax into a visual expression of everything the film has been building toward. The characters are literally being pulled in different directions while trying to stay connected. Max risks himself for Duke, and that action completes the emotional reversal. Earlier, Max believed Duke threatened his life with Katie. Now Max risks his life to protect Duke. The rival has become family. Gidget's arrival gives her determination a payoff, while Snowball's eventual softening provides the film with its characteristically comedic version of redemption. Snowball does not suddenly become a completely different creature, because the movie is not interested in psychological realism at that level. Instead, his anger is diffused through belonging. The same character who once defined himself through rejection receives another chance to be wanted. The ending returns the pets to domestic life, but the home is not exactly the same. Max has changed, and because Max has changed, the apartment means something different. Duke is no longer an intruder. He is family. The final ensemble energy restores the movie's original premise. Humans leave, pets remain, and somewhere behind closed doors their strange secret lives continue. But now we understand that the secret life is not simply about comedy. It is about emotional worlds humans cannot completely see. Max is the clearest example. His greatest flaw is not aggression. It is possessiveness. He believes his security depends on being irreplaceable. His attachment to routine makes him comfortable, but it also makes him fragile. The apartment is his emotional map. Katie's behavior is the compass. When Duke arrives, Max loses the certainty that allowed him to navigate his world. That is why audiences can sympathize with him, even when his behavior becomes selfish. His fear is understandable. His response is not always justified. This distinction is important because many animated protagonists are designed to be immediately lovable and morally straightforward. Max is more flawed. He can be petty, jealous, controlling, and unfair. He blames Duke before understanding him. He values his own comfort over another animal's pain. His growth therefore has more weight because there is something real to overcome. Duke forces Max outside the emotional boundaries of his safe routine. Duke is not simply the obstacle. He is the person who reveals Max's weakness. Without Duke, Max could continue believing that love means permanence and exclusivity. With Duke, he has to confront the possibility that relationships change without necessarily disappearing. That is a difficult lesson even for adults. Max eventually learns cooperation, but more importantly, he learns that family can expand. He becomes a brother rather than a rival. The film compresses this transformation because it has to serve a fast-paced comedy, and that compression is one of its weaknesses. But the underlying arc remains clear. Snowball offers a darker psychological counterpoint. His first appearance is designed for immediate laughter. The sight of a tiny rabbit delivering furious threats is inherently funny, especially when paired with Kevin Hart's rapid, high-energy vocal performance. But Snowball's personality becomes more interesting when the jokes are removed. He leads abandoned pets because he has turned his wound into a cause. His resentment toward humans gives him a sense of purpose. Revenge gives him an identity. If he stops hating humans, he has to face the loneliness underneath the hatred. That is why his character works as a mirror to Max. Max says, in effect, "You cannot take my person away." Snowball says, "Humans already took everything away, so I will make them suffer." Both are attempting to regain control after feeling powerless. The difference is that Max still believes love can save him, while Snowball believes love is what caused the pain. His contradiction is particularly revealing. He wants freedom from human control, yet he creates his own hierarchy among the abandoned pets. He wants belonging, yet he builds belonging around hostility toward outsiders. He rejects human authority while becoming an authority figure himself. The character is not genuinely evil in the traditional sense. He is emotionally wounded and comedically exaggerated. That does not excuse his actions, but it makes his anger legible. His eventual softening therefore has thematic value even if the movie handles it lightly. It suggests that rage can be another form of loneliness. The supporting cast expands these ideas into different personality types. Gidget represents devotion and determination. Her affection for Max is initially a running joke, but her willingness to search for him gives that affection agency. She is not simply waiting to be noticed. She acts. Her apparent delicacy becomes a disguise for competence, making her one of the film's most effective contrasts. Chloe represents another extreme. She is cynical, appetite-driven, and apparently uninterested in emotional drama. Yet her indifference is also a form of personality armor. Buddy is more relaxed, almost detached, providing a counterbalance to Max's intensity. Mel turns compulsive energy into comedy. Tiberius embodies predatory instinct complicated by affection. Pops provides experience and mentorship. Together, these characters form a miniature society of different approaches to companionship. Some animals cling. Some withdraw. Some obsess. Some joke. Some attack. Some simply wait. Their personalities are immediately readable, which is one reason the film moves so quickly. The downside is that a large ensemble means several characters cannot receive much development. Their primary function is often to create jokes, provide movement, or support the central story. But that does not make them useless. In a film built around the fantasy of pets having secret lives, the ensemble is part of the fantasy itself. Every animal suggests another unseen story, and this leads directly to the film's most important thematic question. What does it mean to love someone without owning them? The secret life of pets repeatedly blurs that boundary. Pets are treated as family members, yet humans also make decisions for them. They provide food, shelter, affection, and protection, but they control where animals live and when they leave the house. The film does not attempt to resolve that contradiction philosophically. Instead, it turns it into comedy and adventure. Max experiences Katie's love as both freedom and control. His collar is a marker of ownership, but it is also a marker of identity. His leash restricts movement, yet it also connects him to the person who protects him. The apartment is a safe space, but it can also become a cage when Max becomes obsessed with keeping it unchanged. The streets represent uncertainty, but they also create the possibility of discovery. The film therefore refuses to make freedom and home simple opposites. Max does not ultimately need to escape his home. He needs to understand what home actually means. That is why the apartment matters so much. It represents emotional safety. It is the place where Max knows the rules. Doorways become transitions between certainty and uncertainty. Windows create a boundary between the private pet world and the enormous city outside. Collars and leashes visually communicate the complicated relationship between protection and control. Animal control vehicles represent a more institutional version of the same power. When pets lose their owners, they enter a system that categorizes them. The sewer, meanwhile, represents everything hidden beneath the visible city. It is the perfect symbolic home for animals society has forgotten. They live underneath the streets while human life continues above them. The deeper Max goes, the further he moves from the world in which he felt secure. New York's verticality reinforces this contrast. Apartments rise above sidewalks, rooftops offer new perspectives, tunnels hide beneath streets, and bridges connect separate parts of the city. The environment constantly places the characters between levels, between homes, and between identities. During the climax, water adds another layer of instability. It is difficult to control, impossible to stand firmly within, and constantly moving. The characters who began the film trying to control their circumstances are eventually forced into an environment where control is almost impossible. That is exactly what Max needs. He cannot solve his emotional problem by controlling Duke. He has to adapt. The deeper meaning of the film becomes even clearer when we consider its imaginary society underneath New York. The movie creates a mythology of unseen urban life. Humans walk through the city believing they understand their environment, while the film suggests that another civilization is happening just outside their awareness. Pets are invisible residents of the same spaces. They observe humans without understanding them, just as humans observe pets without understanding everything happening inside their minds. That reversal is central to the premise. The movie never truly proves what pets do when humans leave. Instead, it gives us a fantasy version of what we imagine they might do. The animals become projections of human psychology. Max represents insecurity. Duke represents abandonment. Snowball represents anger. Gidget represents devotion. Chloe represents detachment. Their animal forms make those emotions funny, but the emotions remain human. That is also why the abandoned pets matter. They are the dark underside of pet culture. The cute domestic fantasy has a painful opposite. For every animal with a warm apartment and an owner who returns, there can be an animal without either. Duke's story exposes the fragility of the relationship humans sometimes treat as permanent. Snowball's story exaggerates what happens when rejection becomes identity. Max's story shows what happens when the fear of rejection appears before rejection has even occurred. Three different versions of the same emotional problem. The film's answer is not a philosophical speech. It is the experience of building a new family. Max does not lose Katie. Duke does not erase Max. The family expands. That is the emotional thesis hidden beneath the comedy. Love does not always divide when it is shared. Sometimes it becomes larger. This is where the animation becomes especially important. Illumination MacGuff's visual approach combines stylized realism with cartoon exaggeration. The animals are recognizable enough to feel physically present, but their shapes and expressions are designed for immediate readability. Silhouettes matter. A viewer should be able to recognize Duke's enormous body, Snowball's compact shape, Gidget's small frame, or Chloe's heavy posture almost instantly. The eyes carry enormous emotional weight because animal faces have to communicate feelings without human facial structures. Fur, texture, movement, and posture are exaggerated just enough to transform ordinary animal behavior into readable comedy. A real dog jumping might be cute. A cartoon dog launched across a room becomes a punchline. A real rabbit staring might be harmless. Snowball staring while preparing a revolutionary speech becomes character. The animation constantly translates animal behavior into human storytelling language. New York receives the same treatment. The city is recognizable but heightened. Apartment interiors feel lived in. Streets are dense with movement. Sewer spaces become mysterious and almost mythological. The sausage factory transforms an industrial location into a playground for physical comedy. The bridge provides a huge cinematic space for the final confrontation. Crowd animation and environmental details make the city feel larger than the characters, which is important because the animals are constantly moving through spaces not designed around them. Camera movement supports that sense of scale. The movie frequently moves quickly because its comedy depends on momentum. A joke can be visual, physical, musical, or behavioral, and the animation has to make each one readable almost immediately. The directors therefore rely on contrast. Small animals behave like action heroes. Large animals become emotionally vulnerable. Cute characters enter dangerous environments. Serious situations are interrupted by ridiculous behavior. The film rarely allows one tone to dominate for too long. That is both its strength and one of its weaknesses. Renaud's established relationship with Illumination's comedic language is visible in the emphasis on visual gags, readable character personalities, and rapid escalation. Yarrow Cheney's co-directorial contribution supports the same larger strategy. Keep the story moving, minimize unnecessary exposition, and allow the world to communicate through action. Human characters remain secondary because the entire point is to shift perspective away from them. We see enough of Katie to understand Max's attachment, but we do not spend long periods inside her world. From the animal's perspective, humans are almost like natural forces. They enter, leave, open doors, provide food, create danger, and change the environment without fully understanding the consequences. That decision protects the movie's central fantasy. If the humans became too important, the secret life would no longer feel secret. The direction also understands that emotional pauses are necessary. Without them, the film would become exhausting. Duke's memories, Max's realization of what Duke has lost, and the quieter moments surrounding the pets' relationships give the comedy something to push against. The result is a rhythm of acceleration and release. The movie wants to be funny, but it also wants the audience to care when Max and Duke are separated. That balance is not always perfect, but it is deliberate enough to keep the emotional center alive. And underneath the images, music performs much of the same work. Alexander Desplat's involvement is one of the film's most intriguing production choices, because his musical reputation seems almost unusually sophisticated for such a broad animated comedy. Yet that contrast becomes an advantage. The score gives the film an identity that the jokes alone could not provide. The musical language draws from orchestral traditions while incorporating jazz and urban influences, creating a sound that belongs to New York without simply becoming generic, city music. The idea of George Gershwin meeting Miles Davis captures the spirit of that combination. Classical structure alongside jazz energy, sophistication alongside improvisational movement. Max's domestic world can be musically warmer and more controlled. Duke's arrival disrupts that stability. Action cues increase the tempo. Chase sequences use percussion and movement to turn physical comedy into musical rhythm. The sewer sequences become darker and more adventurous. The Brooklyn Bridge confrontation receives a larger emotional and orchestral scale, because the characters have moved from everyday conflict into genuine danger. Music can tell us how seriously to take a moment. A joke with exaggerated orchestration becomes funnier because the score treats it like an epic event. A quiet cue surrounding Duke can make his emotional history feel larger than the dialogue alone. Gidget can have a musical identity that reinforces her energetic determination. The score therefore operates as an emotional translator. The characters cannot always explain what they feel, but the music can tell us. Licensed songs perform a different function. Taylor Swift's Welcome to New York is an obvious thematic choice, but obvious does not necessarily mean ineffective. It immediately establishes location and energy. Queen's You're My Best Friend connects directly to the movie's obsession with companionship, while songs such as Stayin' Alive create comedic irony through contrast. Recognizable music gives the movie a cultural texture that helps anchor it in a specific moment. The soundtrack therefore works on two levels. The orchestral score creates emotional continuity inside the story, while the licensed songs connect the film to the outside world. Sound design is equally important. Animals need to feel physical. Barking, scratching, chewing, growling, squeaking, claws against surfaces, paws hitting pavement, wings moving through air, and bodies colliding with objects all turn cartoon characters into creatures with weight. The city adds traffic, subway noise, distant voices, sirens, machinery, and underground acoustics. The sewer should sound different from the apartment because the audience needs to feel the change, even when the image is moving quickly. During chase scenes, sound effects can become part of the joke. A sudden impact, squeak, bark, or metallic crash can create a punchline before the audience consciously processes the image. Silence becomes valuable for the same reason. When a film spends so much time making noise, a quiet moment becomes emotionally loud. That is why the softer scenes involving Duke or Max can register so strongly. The soundscape is not merely supporting the action. It is helping define the emotional geography of the film. All of this contributed to the movie's immediate cultural impact. When The Secret Life of Pets arrived in July 2016, the premise was already so easy to understand that marketing had an enormous advantage. Audiences did not need an explanation of why the movie might be funny. They only needed to imagine their own pets behaving strangely when they were away. The film opened to more than $104 million domestically over its first weekend according to Box Office Mojo. A remarkable result for an original animated property. That opening demonstrated the power of a simple universal hook. Snowball quickly became a standout character because his design and personality were perfectly suited to trailers, clips, memes, and social media. Kevin Hart's energetic performance added another layer of recognition. The combination of a tiny rabbit, an oversized personality, and rapid-fire comedy made Snowball immediately shareable. In the social media environment of 2016, where short clips and reaction images could extend a movie's marketing life, that mattered. The film also benefited from the emotional familiarity of pet ownership. Audiences could debate which character reminded them of their own dog or cat. That conversation is powerful because it turns a movie into a personality quiz without formally becoming one. Someone is a Max, someone else is a Chloe. Someone sees their own pet in Mel's compulsive behavior. Someone recognizes the dramatic confidence of Gidget. The movie creates a space where audiences can project their animals onto the screen. That is one reason its commercial success was larger than the sophistication of its screenplay might suggest. People were not buying only a story. They were buying a fantasy about their own homes. The film's long-term importance comes partly from proving that an original animated concept could become a commercial brand. Illumination had already demonstrated enormous strength with Despicable Me and the Minions, but The Secret Life of Pets showed that the studio could step outside that universe and create another set of recognizable characters from scratch. Max, Duke, Snowball, and Gidget were not adaptations of established literary figures. They were new characters built around an everyday question. That matters in a franchise-driven industry. Original animation is risky because audiences cannot rely on prior familiarity. But a premise like this reduces the risk by making the concept itself familiar. Everyone knows pets. Everyone understands the joke. The film therefore created a bridge between originality and familiarity. Its merchandise potential was obvious. Its characters were visually simple, colorful, and easy to recognize. Snowball in particular became the kind of character that could exist independently of the full narrative. Sequels followed, and the property became part of Illumination's broader portfolio. That does not automatically make the film culturally iconic. Financial success and cultural permanence are not the same thing. A movie can earn enormous amounts of money without becoming a defining work of its era. Yet recognition has its own value. A generation that grew up with Max, Duke, and Snowball can carry those images into adulthood. For younger viewers, the movie can function as nostalgia in the same way older animated films function for previous generations. The premise itself helps preserve that recognition because it remains understandable. Pets still behave strangely. Owners still leave home. People still wonder what animals do when they are alone. That basic curiosity does not expire. Critical reception, however, was more complicated than the box office. The movie's animation, premise, voice performances, and comic energy gave critics plenty to appreciate, but the screenplay was often viewed as conventional. That criticism is fair. The structure follows a familiar path. A comfortable protagonist experiences disruption, enters an unfamiliar world, meets allies and enemies, learns a lesson, and returns home changed. The emotional arc is effective because it is recognizable, not because it is structurally revolutionary. Humor can also be uneven. A joke that works for a child may feel obvious to an adult. A visual gag may be memorable for one viewer and forgettable for another. The movie's rapid pacing can create the impression that something is always happening, but constant movement is not the same as narrative depth. Yet that does not mean the film fails. It means the film is operating within a different definition of success. It does not need to be as psychologically intricate as the best Pixar dramas to accomplish its purpose. It needs to create recognizable characters, maintain energy, deliver jokes, and provide an emotional payoff that audiences can understand. On those terms, it is highly effective. The more interesting critical question is whether its emotional ideas deserved more development. The answer is probably yes. Abandonment is a serious subject. The film turns it into a source of comedy, and sometimes that works because humor can make difficult ideas accessible. But sometimes the tonal shift is so abrupt that the emotional implications are barely acknowledged before the next joke arrives. Snowball's trauma is a particularly obvious example. His anger has a believable emotional foundation, but the film treats that foundation lightly because it has to preserve its family comedy tone. Max's selfishness raises another problem. He causes or contributes to several dangerous situations, yet his redemption comes relatively quickly. Duke also has a compelling history that could support a much deeper exploration of abandonment, but the film moves quickly because it is more interested in momentum than prolonged emotional reflection. Gidget's storyline is entertaining, but her romantic feelings for Max are not developed into a particularly complex relationship. The large ensemble creates the same problem. Because so many characters need screen time, individual emotional arcs are compressed. The movie therefore sometimes creates the feeling of a deeper story without fully exploring it. That can produce tonal whiplash. One moment, a character's entire identity is shaped by abandonment. The next, the film is delivering a slapstick joke. One moment, Max is confronting the possibility of losing his home. The next, an animal is behaving absurdly with a piece of food. For some viewers, that contrast is the movie's charm. For others, it weakens the emotional stakes. Both interpretations are reasonable. The film does not have to be perfect for the emotional idea to remain valuable. Its financial performance makes that point even clearer. With a reported production budget of around $75 million and worldwide earnings commonly reported in the roughly $875 million range, the movie became an enormous commercial success. Different sources can vary somewhat depending on accounting conventions and final totals, but the overall scale is undeniable. A film built from the simple idea of pets behaving differently when their owners leave had become a global box office event. The opening weekend demonstrated that the audience was not merely curious. It was ready to embrace the concept at scale. The reasons are relatively straightforward. Pet ownership is universal enough to travel across markets. The visual humor requires limited cultural explanation. The characters have readable personalities. The voice cast adds recognizable names. Universal's distribution provides global reach. Illumination's production model allows the studio to create visually polished animation without relying on the same budgets associated with every major animation competitor. The movie also benefited from extremely efficient marketing. A trailer could communicate the premise in seconds. The financial success therefore became evidence for Illumination's broader business strategy. Simple concepts can become sophisticated commercial properties when they are supported by strong character design, recognizable emotional conflicts, and efficient visual comedy. The success also encouraged the idea that Illumination could build franchises outside Despicable Me and Minions. Max, Duke, Snowball, and Gidget became recurring characters with sequel potential, merchandising opportunities, and licensing possibilities. The studio did not need to depend entirely on established characters. It had demonstrated the ability to create a new brand around a concept that could be summarized in one sentence. That is one of the most important industry lessons of The Secret Life of Pets. In an era when studios increasingly relied on recognizable intellectual property, an original idea could still become a global franchise if the hook was strong enough. The movie's historical significance therefore lies less in changing the language of animation than in demonstrating the commercial power of high-concept originality. It occupies an interesting place within 2010's animation. It is not trying to redefine the medium in the way some landmark Disney or Pixar films have. It is not built around a revolutionary visual technique or an unusually complex narrative. Instead, it represents the strengths of its era. Fast comedy, recognizable celebrity voices, franchise thinking, social media-friendly characters, and concepts that can be communicated instantly. It also reflects Illumination's evolution. The studio's relationship with Despicable Me had established a recognizable comedic identity, but The Secret Life of Pets proved that identity could be transferred to a completely different world. That is strategically important. A studio becomes durable when its creative language is recognizable, even when the characters change. The question of awards or prestige is less important here than the film's ability to remain recognizable. Its legacy is commercial, cultural, and generational rather than primarily critical. It became part of the visual language of 2010's family animation. And yet the film's ability to survive depends on something even simpler. The central fantasy does not age. People will always wonder what pets do when humans are gone. Some of the jokes may feel tied to 2016. Some pop culture references may lose their immediacy. Some pacing choices may feel especially fast to audiences accustomed to different animation styles. But the core emotional conflict remains durable. A pet worries when its owner leaves. A new animal changes the household. A dog can become jealous. A rabbit can look absurdly serious. A city can contain an entire hidden world. Those ideas do not require nostalgia to function. Nostalgia simply adds another layer. For viewers who saw the movie in theaters in 2016, returning to it can evoke the trailers, the songs, the merchandise, the posters, and the experience of seeing Snowball become an instant comic personality. For younger viewers discovering it later, the movie may not feel like a time capsule at all. It may simply feel like a funny animated adventure about animals. Streaming and repeated viewing also changed the relationship with movies like this. A film no longer has to be judged only by the first theatrical impression. Scenes can become memes. Characters can become reaction images. Viewers can revisit favorite sequences without watching the entire story. Over time, those fragments can become more culturally recognizable than the narrative itself. That is another reason Snowball has survived so effectively as an image. His design communicates his personality before he speaks. The film therefore occupies a curious space between timeless premise and dated presentation. Its emotional foundation is durable. Its comedy sometimes belongs unmistakably to its era. Its animation remains energetic and readable. Its soundtrack carries the atmosphere of its release period. Its characters remain easy to recognize. That mixture is exactly what makes the film worth reassessing. So where does that leave The Secret Life of Pets as a piece of filmmaking? The strongest element is still the concept. It is difficult to imagine a more immediately accessible premise for a family animated comedy. The film takes an everyday question and builds an entire cinematic universe around it. Max and Duke provide the emotional center because their chemistry turns a generic rivalry into a story about insecurity and belonging. Snowball supplies the movie's most memorable comedic energy. Gidget provides determination and momentum. The visual design keeps the action readable. The score gives the movie more sophistication than its premise might suggest. The sound design creates physicality. The pacing rarely allows the film to become dull. Its weaknesses are equally clear. Character development is compressed. The supporting cast is sometimes defined more by a single joke than by a full personality. The plot follows familiar structural patterns. Some themes are introduced with greater seriousness than the film is prepared to explore. The third act becomes formulaic in its reliance on escalating action and a large ensemble confrontation. Snowball's trauma is simplified. Max's redemption is somewhat quick. Duke's abandonment could have been explored with greater depth. These are legitimate criticisms. But the question is whether they destroy the movie's effectiveness. They do not. The distinction between great and effective is useful here. The Secret Life of Pets may not belong in the same category as the most sophisticated animated films ever made. Does not need to. It succeeds on its own terms because its premise is powerful, its characters are readable, its comedy is energetic, and its emotional message is accessible. It is a movie designed to entertain a wide audience, and it understands that mission extremely well. More importantly, its emotional core is stronger than its reputation suggests. Beneath the jokes, Max is learning one of the hardest lessons relationships can teach. Being loved does not require being the only one loved. That brings us back to the question we started with. What if the happiest pet in New York is secretly terrified? The answer is Max. He is terrified because he believes happiness depends on permanence. If Katie changes, his world changes. If Duke enters the home, his place becomes uncertain. If love can be shared, then Max has to confront a frightening possibility. Perhaps he was never as secure as he thought. But that fear is not unique to Max. Duke carries it differently. His fear is not replacement but abandonment. He knows what it means to lose a home, which is why Max's jealousy initially seems so small from the perspective of his own history. Snowball takes the same wound in another direction. He has transformed rejection into anger, and anger into identity. Max possesses. Duke mourns. Snowball attacks. These are three different reactions to insecurity, and the movie places all three inside animals so that the audience can laugh before realizing what it is laughing about. That is perhaps the cleverest thing The Secret Life of Pets does without ever announcing that it is doing it. It takes human emotional problems and hides them inside a children's comedy. We laugh at Max being jealous, but we understand the fear beneath the jealousy. We laugh at Duke's awkwardness, but we eventually understand the loneliness beneath it. We laugh at Snowball's theatrical rage, but we can recognize the pain that makes his rage possible. We see pets because pets are safe emotional mirrors. They allow the movie to talk about love without becoming a relationship drama. They allow it to talk about abandonment without becoming a tragedy. They allow it to talk about family without requiring a serious family film. And that is why the idea of home becomes so important. Home is not simply the apartment. It is not the collar, the leash, the bowl, the couch, or the bed. Home is the place where a character believes they are wanted. Max begins the film thinking home belongs to him because Katie loves him. He ends it understanding that home can include someone else without becoming less meaningful. Duke does not destroy Max's home. He becomes part of it. Snowball's story is more chaotic, but even his eventual softening points toward the same need. Underneath revenge is a desire to belong somewhere again. The film never completely resolves the philosophical question of whether pets are truly free or simply dependent on humans in a more affectionate form. Perhaps it does not need to. The animals are both companions and dependents, both loved and controlled, both protected and restricted. The leashes symbolize that contradiction perfectly. A leash can feel like restraint, but it can also be the thing connecting an animal to someone who cares for it. A collar can represent ownership, but it can also identify where an animal belongs. A home can be a safe space, but fear can turn it into a cage. Freedom can be exciting, but freedom without belonging can become loneliness. The film keeps moving between these opposites without fully resolving them, and that ambiguity gives the premise more emotional weight than its bright colors might suggest. Maybe that is why the movie remains so easy to revisit. We do not necessarily return because every joke still works. We return because the central feeling still does. Most people know what it is like to fear being replaced. Most people know what it is like to enter a new environment and wonder whether they belong. Most people know the difference between being loved and actually feeling secure. Max's problem is not that Katie stops loving him. His problem is that he cannot believe her love can expand. And when he finally learns that it can, the story becomes more than a pet comedy. It becomes a small, colorful lesson about emotional scarcity. We often behave as if love is a limited quantity. If someone else receives attention, we imagine there is less available for us. If a family grows, we fear our place will shrink. If a friend finds another friend, we wonder whether we have become unnecessary. Max's journey challenges that assumption. Duke is not the end of Max's relationship with Katie. He is the beginning of a larger family. That is a simple idea, but simple does not mean meaningless. In fact, the simplicity may be exactly why it reaches so many people. The Secret Life of Pets does not ask the audience to solve a philosophical puzzle. It asks them to recognize a feeling. And perhaps the most revealing thing about that feeling is that it exists everywhere. In apartments, families, friendships, classrooms, workplaces, and relationships, people constantly ask the same silent question Max asks. Am I still enough? The movie's answer is not that insecurity disappears. Max remains Max, Duke remains Duke. Snowball remains dramatically Snowball. The answer is that belonging can survive change. Love can survive expansion. A home can become larger without becoming less yours. That is the hidden emotional message underneath the barking, chasing, screaming, chewing, crashing, and absurdity. The Secret Life of Pets is not ultimately about what animals do when humans leave. It is about what happens inside a relationship when someone fears they are no longer enough. And perhaps that is why the movie's central fantasy works so well. We imagine our pets have secret lives because, in a way, we know they do. They have feelings we cannot completely see. They experience routines we do not fully understand. They create attachments, habits, fears, and loyalties inside worlds that overlap with ours but are never identical to ours. The film exaggerates that idea into comedy, but the emotional truth underneath it is familiar. We are all, in some way, trying to figure out where we belong. Max simply has to learn it in the middle of New York, alongside a dog who used to be a rival, a rabbit who turned rejection into revolution, a tiny dog who refuses to give up, and a city full of animals whose lives continue long after the human door closes. And maybe that is the final secret. The pets do have lives when we leave, but the movie's deeper point is that their lives are not separate from the question of love. They are shaped by who comes back, who stays, who leaves, and who learns to make room for someone new. Max begins by believing that love means being chosen alone. He ends by discovering something better. Sometimes being loved means discovering that there is room for one more. And when the apartment door closes again, the world does not become empty. Somewhere inside, Max, Duke, Gidget, Chloe, Snowball, and the others continue their strange little lives, carrying the same fears, friendships, and loyalties that made them feel so human in the first place. That may be why, years after the jokes and trailers of 2016 have faded, the question still works. Not because we truly believe our pets are secretly throwing parties when we leave, but because we understand the feeling behind the fantasy. We want to believe that even when we cannot see the people or animals we love, the connection is still there. And sometimes the greatest fear is not being alone. It is wondering whether someone else has taken our place. The Secret Life of Pets spends 90 minutes turning that fear into comedy, then quietly answers it with something much more reassuring. Love does not always disappear when the world changes. Sometimes it simply makes room.